Good morning. Welcome to the final session of the November meeting. As usual, please make sure your phones are off, or at least silent. We begin with the final group of inductions for the meeting. Dr. Hauser.
Good morning. Will Dr. Dawn A. Bunnell please come forward to the President's desk to sign the roll book and then receive a formal welcome from the President? Mr. President, I have the honor to present Dawn A. Bunnell, Senior Vice Provost for Research and the Henry Robinson Town Professor of Engineering and Applied Science at the University of Pennsylvania. She is recognized for advances in atomic imaging and local electronic structure of complex surfaces, obtaining the first scanning interfaces in electronic and plasmonic hybrid nanostructures and ferroelectric nanolithography. In her capacity as Senior Vice Provost, she has overseen campus-wide research planning efforts, connections between the university and industry, and the transfer of technologies from labs to the public sector. Among other things, she has served as president of AVS Science and Technology Society and as vice president of the American Ceramic Society.
By the authority and in the name of the American Philosophical Society, held at Philadelphia for promoting useful knowledge, I do admit you a member thereof. Congratulations.
Please come over and take a picture.
For photo. Right.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Thank you. Come on.
Yeah.
Will Dr. Gerald Early please come forward to the President's desk to sign the roll book and then receive a formal welcome from the President? Mr. President, I have the honor to present Gerald Early, Merrill Kling Professor of Modern Letters and Professor of African and African American Studies and English at Washington University, St. Louis. He is a noted essayist and American culture critic with his essay collection, Modern American Culture, winning the 1994 National Book Critics Circle Award for Criticism. In addition to his own publications, he is a prolific anthologist, launching and editing Best African American Essays 2010 with Randall Kennedy and Best African American Fiction 2010 with Nikki Giovanni. He served as a consultant on several of Ken Burns' documentary films, including Unforgivable Blackness, The Rise and Fall of Jack Johnson, The War, The Roosevelts, An Intimate History, and Jackie Robinson, all of which aired on PBS. He was nominated by Barack Obama to serve on the National Council of the Humanities, was awarded a star on the St. Louis Walk of Fame. Walk of Fame, yes. and served as a consultant for the National Baseball Hall of Fame and Museum in Cooperstown on, and I quote, Souls of the Game, Voices of the Black Baseball Experience, the reconception of their permanent Blacks and Baseball exhibit.
By the authority and in the name of the American Philosophical Society, held at Philadelphia for promoting useful knowledge, I do admit you a member thereof. Congratulations. Please come over, please.
Congratulations. It's an honor to meet you. Thank you. Will Dr. Daniel T. Gilbert please come forward to the President's desk to sign the roll book and then receive a formal welcome from the President? Mr. President, I have the honor to present Daniel Gilbert, Edgar Pierce Professor of Psychology at Harvard University. His research explores how human beings navigate the complexities of time and social life, using science to uncover the illusions people have about the world, themselves, and each other. His book, Stumbling on Happiness, spent 6 months on the New York Times bestseller list and was awarded the Royal Society's General Book Prize for Best Science Book of the Year. He is a contributor to NPR's All Things Considered, the host and co-writer of the award-winning Nova television series, The Emotional Life, and has hosted 3 TED Talks, including The Surprising Science of Happiness, Why We Make Bad Decisions, and the psychology of your future self. He's a recipient of the William James Fellow Award from the Association for Psychological Science for his contributions to social psychology.
By the authority and in the name of the American Philosophical Society, held at Philadelphia for promoting useful knowledge, I do admit you a member thereof. Congratulations.
Congratulations.
And not
Pleasure.
a bad decision by the membership.
Will Dr. Sharon Hamas Schiffer please come forward to the President's desk to sign the roll book and then receive a formal welcome from the President. Mr. President, I have the honor to present Sharon Hamas Schiffer, Professor of Chemistry at Princeton University. Her work encompasses the development of analytical theories and computational methods, as we heard yesterday, as well as experimentally relevant systems. She's devised theories of proton-coupled electron transfer and computational strategies for nuclear electronic quantum chemistry, including the invention of the nuclear electronic orbital approach. She has used these approaches to investigate quantum mechanical effects in chemical, biological, and interfacial processes. She's a recipient of the American Chemical Award in Theoretical Chemistry and of the Joseph O. Hirschfelder Prize in Theoretical Chemistry. She currently serves as the editor-in-chief of Chemical Reviews, is on the Board of Reviewing Editors for Science, and on the editorial board for the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences.
By the authority and in the name of the American Philosophical Society, held at Philadelphia for promoting useful knowledge, I do admit you a member thereof. Congratulations. Please come over here for photo.
Congratulations, and thanks for your wonderful talk yesterday. Will Dr. Kelly Jones please come forward to the President's desk to sign the roll book and then receive a formal welcome from the President. Mr. President, I have the honor to present Kelly Jones, Hans Hofmann Professor of Modern Art in the Department of Art History and Archaeology and Chair of the Department of African American and African Diaspora Studies at Columbia University. Her research interests include African American and African diaspora artists, Latinx and Latin American artists, and issues in contemporary art and museum theory. Her book, South of Pico, African American Artists in Los Angeles in the 1960s and 1970s, received the Walter and Lillian Lowenfeld's Criticism Award from the as part of the American Book Awards in 2018, was named a Best Book of the Decade in 2019 by Art News, Best Art Book of 2017 in the New York Times, and a Best Book of 2017 in Art Forum. She has curated at institutions including the Walker Art Center and the Studio Museum in Harlem, and served as guest curator for a variety of venues, such as the Sao Paulo Biennial and the Johannesburg Biennial. Her exhibition, Now Dig This, Art in Black Los Angeles, 1960 to 1980, at the Hammer Museum, was named Best Exhibition of 2011 and 2012 by Art Forum, and the Best Thematic Show nationally by the International Association of Art Critics.
By the authority and in the name of the American Philosophical Society, held at Philadelphia for promoting useful knowledge, I do admit you a member thereof. Congratulations. Please, over here for the photo. Thank you.
Congratulations and thank you for this morning. Will Dr. Eve Martyr please come forward to the President's desk to sign the roll book and then receive a formal welcome from the President? Mr. President, I have the honor to present Eve Martyr, Victor and Gwendolyn Beinfeld, Professor of Neuroscience and University Professor in the Biology Department and Bolin Center at Brandeis University. Her work has had an exceptional impact on our understanding of the function of the nervous system, demonstrating that neuronal circuits are not hardwired, but can be reconfigured by neuromodulatory neurons and substances to produce a variety of outputs. Her lab pioneered studies of homeostatic regulation of intrinsic membrane properties while stimulating work on the mechanisms by which brains remain stable while allowing for change during development and learning. Her work has been decades ahead of her field with research principles she enunciated in the 1980s, addressing complex nervous systems recently and being applied more broadly. She's the recipient of the Miriam Saltpeter Lifetime Achievement Award for Women in Neuroscience, the Carl Spencer Lashley Prize from the American Philosophical Society, and the National Medal of Science from Joe Biden.
By the authority and in the name of the American Philosophical Society, held at Philadelphia for promoting useful knowledge, I do admit you a member thereof. Congratulations. Please come over here for a photo.
There we go.
A little bit further. Got it.
Congratulations and thank you. Will Professor Carl J. Oja please come forward to the President's desk to sign the roll book and then receive a formal welcome from the President? Mr. President, I have the honor to present Carol J. Oja, William Powell Mason Professor of Music and Professor of American Studies at Harvard University and Faculty Director of the Humanities at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study. She is a cultural historian of music, focusing on American music and culture with an emphasis on interracial history and social justice. She's the recipient of numerous publication prizes, including the Music in America Cultural Award from the American Musicological Society for her book Bernstein Meets Broadway, Collaborative Art in a Time of War, as well as the Loewens Books Award from the Society for American Music and an ASCAP Deems-Taylor Book Award for Making Modern Music, New York in the 1920s. She was the co-director, along with Christine Linklater, of the Digital Humanities exhibit, Eileen Southern and the Music of Black Americans. She is a member of the Collegium of Scholars of the Martin Luther King Jr. College of Ministers and Laity at Morehouse College, served as Leonard Bernstein Scholar in Residence at the New York Philharmonic, twice chaired the Pulitzer Prize Committee in Music, and was a visiting fellow of the Japan Society for the Promotion of Science.
By the authority and in the name of the American Philosophical Society, held at Philadelphia for promoting useful knowledge, I do admit you a member thereof. Congratulations. Please come over here for the photo.
Here we go.
Sir?
Yes, congratulations, and thank you for your talk a while back. It was terrific. Will Dr. Marilyn Raphael Please come forward to the President's desk to sign the roll book and then receive a formal welcome from the President. Mr. President, I have the honor to present Marilyn Raphael, Director of the Institute on Environment and Sustainability, Professor in the Department of Geography at the University of California, Los Angeles, and Affiliate Scientist with the National Center for Atmospheric Research. She's an internationally recognized Antarctic research scientist, best known for her work on climate change and variability in the South Polar region. Among her contributions, she established the significance of the atmospheric zonal wave 3 pattern in Antarctic climate and created the ZW3 Index. She is a key leader in international scientific efforts with the World Climate Research Program's Polar Climate Predictability Initiative, where she serves as co-chair. She's organized scientific workshops in Argentina, Australia, Canada, Malaysia, New Zealand, Norway, and the United States, and has been proactive in efforts to increase minority representation in science, including the National Science Foundation-funded effort to create a pipeline of underrepresented students starting at the pre-college level. She's a recipient of an Atmospheric Science Librarian's International Choice Award for her co-authored book, The Encyclopedia of Weather and Climate Change, a Complete Visual Guide.
By the authority and in the name of the American Philosophical Society, held at Philadelphia for promoting useful knowledge, I do admit you a member thereof. Congratulations. Let's come over here for the photo.
Whoops. There we are.
Okay.
Thank you. Congratulations. I'm delighted to meet you. Thank you. And last but by no means least this morning, will Governor Thomas Wolfe please come forward to the President's desk to sign the roll book and then receive a formal welcome from the President. Mr. President, I have the honor to present Thomas Wolfe, former governor of Pennsylvania. Now, this is kind of an odd situation because we're welcoming Thomas Wolfe to be a member of the society now. But if you have read the list of officers and members of the society, you will know that for 2 terms as governor of the state of Pennsylvania, Tom Wolfe was the patron of the society. So he deserves our thanks for that as well. So he is an exceptional scholar, businessman, and public servant who began his career in service volunteering with the Peace Corps before earning his doctorate in political science, which won an award from the American Political Science Association. I'll say it again, American Political Science Association, and then segueing into business with his family's firm, Wolfe Products. He demonstrated business acumen by saving the company from near bankruptcy and returning it to profitability. Throughout his business career, he was always active in civic organizations in his local community, thus leading him to serve 2 terms as the 47th governor of Pennsylvania. His tenure is noted for progressive policies on fracking in state parks, a moratorium on the death penalty in Pennsylvania, and the expansion of Medicaid under the Affordable Care Act.
By the authority and in the name of the American Philosophical Society, held at Philadelphia for promoting useful knowledge, I do admit you a member thereof. Congratulations. Go over here for the photo.
Thank you, thank you. It's fun. Congratulations. That's terrific.
Vice President Caroline Bynum will now take the stage to introduce our panel.
Good morning and welcome to our final session. I have one housekeeping matter to announce. There is a 1 p.m. bus to the airport, which has only a few spaces left. So if you need to reserve on the 1 p.m. bus, please check in at registration. There is, as you know, another bus at 3. There's a very special session arranged for us this morning by the program committee, and we are waiting for things to get set up so we can have that special session. Back when the APS first started to plan this November meeting, a number of members requested that we address the presidential election, which would be held just before the meeting. Now, the challenge of planning such a session was that, of course, we didn't know what we would be talking about. And hard as it is to remember, but a little less than 2 weeks ago, the polls were so close that the people planning the session for this morning weren't even sure that by today the election would be decided. Of course, now we know what happened. And the question before us is, what next? What does this all mean? Today's panel will try to give us some answers to these questions. I've been asked to keep the introductions quite short to give the panel more time for discussion. So, come on up. So, I'll start by introducing Mark Thompson, who's the moderator of today's panel. Mark was elected to the APS in 2017, and when he's not serving on the APS's Committee on Meetings and organizing panels, he is the CEO of CNN. Mark will be joined by Trudy Rubin, the Foreign Affairs correspondent for the Philadelphia Inquirer, by Anita L, a philosopher and lawyer and one of the foremost thinkers on the social justice implications of the application of law, and by Alan Blender, presidential advisor and one of the world's most influential economists. Mark will take over from here and moderate the panel and the question period. So please join me in welcoming our very distinguished panel.
Well, I think that line about not knowing what was going to happen rings very true to me. I mean, and on November the 5th and through till about, I guess, 4 or 5 in the morning on November the 6th, I was in the control room of one of our big studios in Washington, D.C. And just like this panel, ready for, as were every eventuality. You'll recall in 2020, it was around lunchtime, Eastern time, on the Saturday after the Tuesday election, that CNN, New York Times and others called Joe Biden as the winner. And there were credible scenarios where this could have gone on longer, particularly with legal challenges. People remember how long it took in the year 2000 and the Supreme Court indeed to determine a president. So that night, watching the results come in, and everyone here will understand the results do not come in a particularly initially decipherable way. Different packages of votes in different states come in, and actually one of the tasks, one of my tasks with colleagues, is to try and I always think we should have a big banner over every newsroom saying, we don't know what's going to happen. It's very tempting for journalists to get ahead of themselves. We were ready for every eventuality. And it's only, I would say, in the sort of 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock, 10:30, 11 o'clock, where we have excellent specialists, the decision desk, our political director, our director of news, and we were in a kind of huddle the whole time, trying to call it, and recognizing this could have been like 2020, a shape-shifting election where there's a long passage where it looks like it's going one way and then it swings another way, and maybe even back the first way. But there came a point where everything was pointing in one direction, which was a very, very clear, broad turn to the Republicans and the candidacy of Donald Trump, and very little noise around stolen election or legal disputes. It was what it was. I think it was in 1919 that the American John Reed wrote 10 Days That Shook the World about the October Revolution in Russia 2 years earlier. I think we're day 11 after this this election, and there's a distinct tremor, you'd have to say, not just in Washington but in capital cities around the world, and of course an extraordinary diversity of reaction. I mean, jubilation and a sense of vindication, not just in the immediate Trump circle, as it were, and the kind of MAGA, but through much of America, a real sense of jubilation, and of course for tens of millions of other Americans and America's allies, a real sense of foreboding. One of the things I think we're all going to recognise, this is early in the story, and for many people, the events, as it turned out 11 days ago, the election, are still very raw, and we're going to try and remember that as we go forward. At the same time, we're here to break that rule about we don't know what's going to happen, and try and get a sense of what this means, what it could mean, and in a sense what to look for. But I just wonder. I mean, I said I was in the control room in a sort of dispassionate, technocratic mode. Let's get this right. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. Anita, I mean, particularly given your within your very, very broad realm of expertise, your focus on rights, and in particular, I might pick out women's reproductive rights, but also just as a citizen, what was your first reaction whenever it was when you began to sense the way that the election was going?
Well, you're in your technocratic mode, and I'm in my fuzzy slippers in my home, but maybe having some of the same reactions. So I am very concerned about America's future, and it's not just because of one individual, Donald Trump, with whom I happen to disagree about many things, but it's something broader that I think we can call Trumpism, which will last, I fear, beyond the man himself. And the features of Trumpism that give me a lot of concern would be, of course, a leader who exhibits grandiosity and narcissism, a leader who is strategically deceptive and manipulative, leaders who disparage other people's traits, insult frequently, leaders who don't shy away from implicit and explicit racism, sexism, and xenophobia, demonization of other people that you happen to disagree with for political advantage. I have a long list, I got like 3 more, There's 10, these are, I guess, the anti-commandments, like don't do this, but these are the features of Trumpism that I think we need to be concerned about, and it's a serious list. Next on the list would be demagoguery as a political style, vengefulness, raw exercises of power, disdain for rules and rule of law, elected leaders and leadership, and then, of course, tyranny that's buttressed by by fake Christianity, of all things, right? So there's this list of features of our political life that I believe will survive Donald Trump, and that will, for perhaps generations, make public life more difficult. You asked me about reproductive rights, and what am I thinking about there? So like a lot of women and people, I was very concerned about the implications of the election for women's reproductive rights, because Mr. Trump promised that he would seek to have a national abortion ban. A national abortion ban would be a disaster. Already we have a chaotic 50-state potpourri of abortion policies. Women don't know where to go, what to do. I gave a keynote lecture last year at the American Society for Reproductive Medicine, and I talked to a lot of fertility doctors. They're terrified to do their work. So we have chaos on the ground already. A national abortion ban would mean more deaths, more unwanted pregnancies, more unwanted children, right? Hardship all around. So would the Supreme Court strike down a federal abortion ban? That might have been a hope we could have had 10 years ago. But I fear that if Congress were to pass a national abortion ban of some sort, that this particular Supreme Court, which is largely now run by a hand-picked majority of conservatives, would uphold the ban. And I ask you, where would we be then? Where would we be then?
And back in 2016, when Donald Trump was pretty new to the national stage, I mean, a very well-known celebrity, but as a politician, a relatively new figure, you could say, well, perhaps people voted Donald Trump into office without knowing what he stood for, what he wanted to do, and so forth. But I think you'd have to say, in 2024, I mean, there's a lot of filigree, but nonetheless, he was pretty clear on many of the things he wanted to do, not particularly clear, except on reproductive rights, where he was often contradictory. But people appear to have had a pretty good idea of what Donald Trump stood for, and yet a majority of Americans voted for him, and many groups, even if the majority didn't vote for them, there was a significant movement in the group. He got slightly more of women's votes than a bigger proportion than in 2020, for example. He obviously made inroads in some, at least, significantly male members of different ethnic minorities. How do you process that? That this is, when we talk about tyranny and so forth, this is also a democratic election which has been won pretty cleanly, I mean, and with a significant clean margin, by someone who has been fairly straightforward about these things.
Well, part of being fairly straightforward about these things has been very successful demonization of the alternative, in this case Kamala Harris, and other Democrats, by the way. Demonization, construing them with lies and deception as very, very bad and dangerous people who are out to undermine America. Yeah. So it isn't so much that I think people like Donald Trump's characteristics or love Trumpism as such, but I do think a lot of people are not fully aware of the impact that Trumpism is having on their own thinking about their political futures. It was horrifying for me, especially as a woman of color, to have Kamala Harris depicted as some sort of crazy, unintelligent extremist who's going to rip and tear at the fabric of America and put us in some horrible dark ages. Trump was successful in communicating that message. People were afraid. Plus, she's a woman, right? And we've never had a woman president before, and I think some people are afraid of our Hillarys and our Kamalas because they think that somehow a woman leader would represent something very, very negative. But I've sat here for the last 2 years watching a stream of women walk across this stage, and your jaw drops. The brilliance, the contributions.
Yeah. Well, we've heard some more this morning.
Exactly. I mean, exactly. Yeah. So who wouldn't want a woman to run this country? Yeah. I'm ready. I'm ready.
Yeah. And as you know, in many other countries, this is not really developed countries. this is not an issue anymore. I mean,
Right, Scandinavia, UK, where you come from originally, Germany. I mean, there's absolutely no reason right now, no good reason to think that a woman would be a bad leader. But I do believe that a lot of working class men, and some working class women, but working class men, feel emasculated by the idea that the president would be a woman.
Let me just press you on one point. There was a TV spot, really, an ad, which the Trump campaign played very, very widely, particularly in breaks, for example, inside NFL games. And this was aiming at very specific, obviously specific voting groups, essentially men. But the ad was about trans rights. And the ad showed a clip of Kamala Harris from some years ago, but nonetheless, talking about the availability of trans therapy and treatment to prisoners, to trans people in prisons. And the tagline was something like, Kamala's for they, them, Donald's for you.
Yes.
Or she's for that, I'm for you. And we don't know, and scholars will, are going to do the heavy lifting on trying to figure this out. But there's I think a strong body of intuitive opinion that this ad was actually pretty significant in terms of impact as a sort of a successful partisan piece of political messaging. It makes me think, it makes me want to ask whether or not there are limits to the rate at which social change can be affected without triggering a disproportionate and widespread backlash, whether there is something that people who absolutely believe in and want to push forward an agenda of justice and support and care for minorities need to bear in mind, whether it's a kind of fact of life. And you say you have a country which we have a country which may not, many members of which may not yet be willing to accept a woman as president, and who struggle. Perhaps they've never met a trans person. Perhaps it just freaks them out in some generic way and feels a break
As
with
did
tradition.
gay sex 20 years ago, freaked people out.
Are is the right response, if you like, from the Democratic Party and from progressives to say, honestly, that kind of stupidity, you've just got to fight it, you've got to double down on these things? Is there anything about the pace at which these things happen? And the messaging around them by progressive politicians?
Well,
if you want to get, bluntly, if you want to get into power.
Yeah. So if you want to get into power. So I'm a product of the 1960s. I was born in 1953. So I was born before Brown versus Board of Education. When I was in junior high school and high school, the public schools in the state of Georgia, where I was living, were just being integrated under court orders. I was living in a world in which I couldn't go to the public swimming pool or go to the bowling alley the same day as the white kids. And so I had this background in which everything in the society was telling me that I was inferior, and yet there was something in the culture that made me feel as if I could do it. And so, John Kennedy was one of those things, and Martin Luther King was one of those things, and, we pushed forward. And so I was optimistic because I saw progressive change happening, and it seemed natural that there would be, over time, we would have the public come to realize our worth by demonstrating our value and our virtue, and that things would continually get better and better. So a little girl whose mother thought she would only maybe be a housemaid goes to Harvard Law School. Yeah. How'd that happen? Yeah. Right, okay. So I think that the Democrats shouldn't think that, we can't push change too fast, because look at the horizon. I mean, women have had the vote for, more than 100 years now, but there's been a struggle. And so it's not like our time horizon should be, well, Hillary ran and she lost, and then, he won. It should be like, what was going on in the 1840s, what was going on, think about it that way. Then I think our impatience for change makes a lot of sense, and we're not trying to rush it. Now, politically, there's a sense of that maybe we do need to slow down. I mean, I can understand some people thinking like that, but I think that may not be the right way to think. I think the bolder, let's keep pushing approach, and let's figure out a way to make what should work is more dignifying and more respectful, and it may ultimately be more successful.
Yeah. So I'm sure we'll come back to this puzzle of what's the recipe for a successful political challenge to Trumpism? And what's the mixture of radicalism and belief and pragmatism to midterms coming in 26, another presidential election in 28. These are important moments, and working backwards, the sooner you start trying to figure out how that party, the Democratic Party in opposition, begins to figure out what's the right way back is important. But I wonder, Alan, if I can turn to you. One of the perhaps not surprises, but one of the striking features of the Wednesday after the Tuesday, when people woke up to discover very definitely what the future was the markets, and the markets were very lively in terms of the response to the Trump victory. Now, some part of that might simply be markets prefer certainty to uncertainty, and no doubt there would have been a bounce for a Kamala Harris victory as well, somewhat. But it was, the enthusiasm was nonetheless striking. When you woke up on the Wednesday, did you share that enthusiasm?
No, I wanted to pull the covers over my head and go back to sleep. That reaction was not a surprise to me, because I've been watching markets for a long time. And one thing I learned this vividly in the Clinton administration, which was great for rich people. The stock market just shot up to new highs. They never forgave Bill Clinton for raising their marginal tax rate. And that's all these people care about. It's a fallacy to which many people succumb, that the broad public is what determines market prices. It's a tiny number of people trading on their own account and trading for other rich people that make market prices. I mean, I own assets and I don't have any liabilities. Zero. I own assets. I don't trade them. They sort of sit there, and when I die, they're going to go to my children. But there's a huge amount of trading in markets, a gigantic amount of trading in markets, and it's dominated by people who are focused incredibly myopically on their own marginal tax rate. And Trump was going to be good for their marginal tax rate, and Kamala Harris had already said she's going to be bad for it. These are over 400,000 per annum earners. So I wasn't a bit surprised. I was horrified, but not surprised.
People often talk as if, maybe ordinary Americans vote with their pocketbook, but elites think about higher thoughts. It turns out that elites also think about the pocketbook.
Yeah, those are different pocketbooks I was just talking about. Those men and women are not so concerned about the price of eggs.
Yeah.
It's a pretty small beer for them. People often vote for what they think is their economic interest, and they're often deluded about that. And a good enough con man, and we have the greatest con man now as the president-elect, can convince them otherwise. You may remember years ago, there was this famous book, What's the Matter with Kansas?
Yeah.
And that was the theme, that with cultural issues and other things like that, you could get people to vote against their own economic interests. And we just saw a lot of people vote against their own economic interests. If you rack up what Harris said and what Trump said, and think about what might that mean for the typical earner that makes $50,000 a year, it's not a close contest. It's not anywhere a close contest. And yet, a lot of those voters voted for Trump.
And is that partly a point about how capitalist this country is? That even people without money and without wealth have, in a way which frankly drives a rather amazing economy, have that aspiration to become that thing. And so they are thinking of a future state. Now, that future state may not happen, right? But I think that's almost the definition of the American dream, is believing that it might happen, and therefore being against inheritance tax, death duties, because although you haven't got a penny to leave anyone, you strongly hope that one day you will.
Yep. I think that's right. I've never seen any hard data on this, so I don't say this with great confidence. But it does look to me, from a number of external appearances, including the attitudes towards the inheritance tax. I'll come back in one sentence on that in a second, that more Americans that can never, ever, ever hope realistically that they're going to be in the top 1% of the income distribution, nonetheless harbor that dream. And that can get them voting or expressing political opinion that is contrary to what is their actual interest. The inheritance tax is not, if you took a naive political science view of the inheritance tax, this should be overwhelmingly popular. This is the lower 99% taxing the upper 1/2% or something like that. It shouldn't even be close. But it is close, and it's not popular, even apart from the clever sloganeering that the Republicans years ago introduced. It's the death tax.
Yes.
I used to say to people, there is no tax on dying. There's no such thing. And the number of estates that are taxable, because we keep raising the exempt amount, is truly trivial. Now, the number of dollar bills represented that is not trivial, but the number of people that are actually affected by it is trivial.
Can we talk a bit about inflation? And I just wonder how, I think inflation is interesting. I think it's likely to get underestimated as people think about the election, because inflation it's not good for a political argument. You can't get it's not amenable to an ideological clash in quite the same way that some of the other topics are. But election results are multifactorial. It's very difficult, even with years of work afterwards by political scientists, to be sure about the weighting of those different factors for different voters. But what's your sense about how significant inflation was in the result?
Pretty significant in the economic sphere. Now, there are other spheres that we've been talking about, and we'll
values and so forth.
Talk about foreign affairs and things like that. But within the economic bundle, so to speak, I think inflation was quite significant. Now, let me say a couple of things about that. There's a whole huge economic literature on the cost of inflation. So it's not that there are costs of inflation. We'd rather have low inflation than bad inflation for a whole host of reasons that I won't take the time to get into. But a lot of economists, including myself, have been amazed over the years about how virulent public opinion is against inflation, stacked against what we can measure as the actual cost of inflation. I mean, it's a bad thing. Better not to have it. But the dislike or fear or whatever you want to say about inflation has always seemed higher than the actual cost. Many economists, certainly including myself, learned two things about this election. First of all, that skewed view, if you want to call it that, of how costly inflation is, if anything, underestimated what the voters actually think, that they were more anti-inflation. We knew they were anti-inflation. They were more anti-inflation than we thought they were. The bigger surprise, however, to me, is that everything in the economic literature measuring the cost of inflation is measuring the cost of inflation. So inflation means the rate of change of the price level. It does not mean the price level. Yeah. It does not mean comparing the price of a box of eggs now to what it was 4 years ago.
Which is what most ordinary people do.
Which I think a lot of people do. Now, I want to say just one last sentence about that. The last time we had very high inflation, it was even higher than the recent episode, back in the Reagan presidency. He ran for re-election and got elected in a landslide in 1984, partly on the strength of falling inflation, which had been in double digits and was down to about 5%-ish or something when he ran for re-election. And I'm old enough to have been very cognizant then. I was not a kid. And nobody was bringing up what eggs cost 5 years previously. Nobody. So that jibed with the way economists think about inflation. It's the rate of inflation that exacts social costs, not the fact that things now, because of past inflation, cost more than they used to. One more half sentence.
Yeah, please, of course.
We know how to solve that problem, which is cause of depression.
Yeah.
The people don't want that.
And which was as it were, the imminent threat in the COVID and immediate kind of.
Yeah, we had a little
post-COVID.
bit of that, tiny bit.
But I mean, in other words, it was the kind of governmental monetary response to the risk of recession, which is at least part of the cause, presumably, of this spike in inflation, not just in America, but in
that
many
we
other
did
countries.
not want the depression.
Yeah.
The price level fell about 33% in the Great Depression.
Yeah.
Eggs got cheaper.
Yeah. The other point I'd make about inflation is that it's been a feature, obviously, of economies across the world, particularly not all, but almost all of the developed world. And there's a phrase, I think I picked it up from a writer in the Financial Times, and the phrase is, inflation kills incumbents. In other words, this has been an extraordinary year for elections. More than 4 billion people live in countries which have had elections this year of every kind, Russian elections, and so on. Some of them not really democratic elections, but half the planet has been in countries with elections, and many developed countries had something like 9 or 10 developed countries had elections. There's an extraordinary pattern of incumbents losing. And it's really important to say that although there's a sort of loose narrative which says basically, kind of centre-left parties are losing to sort of right-wing strongmen and nationalism, and you can see some threads of that. Actually, what's happened is I think has been much more mixed ideologically. So, we see, if you take the Olaf Scholz ample coalition, the traffic light coalition, it seems very likely to lose early next year to the centre right. That's probably a move to the right coming in Germany. But in terms of losses and kind of bloody noses, as it were, the UK Conservative Party of Rishi Sunak, very noisily anti-woke, noisily anti-immigration, lost to Labour. Emmanuel Macron's sort of centre, really a pretty bloody nose from the French public. And although it's possible that means Marine Le Pen's on the way, it might not. Narendra Modi in populist Hindu nationalist in India, bloody nose, and so on and so forth. So this business of the impact of a population not inured to inflation, after years of low inflation, so arguably by the 1980s, many populations have got quite used to some years of quite high inflation. The inflation arrives for the first time, and it turns out that people really don't like it. But I just ask Trudy, this election, every American election is observed closely around the world, but amongst the people looking anxiously at the unfolding numbers were political leaders and opinion formers in many of the world's capital cities and elsewhere, both amongst America's allies, its enemies, or and kind of third-party countries. What so far do we know about them and their reaction?
Before I get to that, I just want to say one thing in response to what we've been discussing so far. I get a lot of hate mail from my column, and since the election, I've been responding with just one word, or maybe it's a phrase, and it's Luke 23:34. Now, I'm Jewish, and I don't usually quote the New Testament, but as some of you may know, Luke 23:34 says, "Lord, forgive them, for they know not what they do." And I think a lot of this election, apart from the 32%, which the Pew Research Center says want authoritarian strongman or military government, and that is the same percentage as 15 years ago when I first saw that percentage in Pew statistics, might have been even earlier. A lot of the others, I think, fall in the Luke category. As far as the way the world is looking at this election, I think the world, whether it's enemies or allies, see what we see from within the United States, which is that at a time of great global shifts, when alliances matter more than ever, because there is now an alliance of autocrats that we see operating with China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea, who are trying to expand that audience and entice mid-level powers and developing countries into close relationship with their view of the world, which is that strong men can rule more effectively and that China is a more effective role model. At that time, if democracy matters, an alliance of democratic powers, both in Europe, of course, the United States in critical position, and in Asia, is more important than ever. And what people view from abroad is the election of a president who truly believes I alone can fix it. And we see that already in the appointments that he has made, because it is clear that he is not looking for expertise or advice. When you have a nomination to head defense, whose main category is that he's a fox talking head, who will promote the idea that expertise is unnecessary and that the top ranks of the Pentagon must be dumped, not because they may be ineffective or they went the wrong way on certain developments overseas, but because they were not loyal to Trump. When you have a director of national intelligence who is a mouthpiece for Russian conspiracy theories, and when you have a first best friend who is apparently, I mean, this is in B.B. Rebozo with Nixon. This is the richest man in the world who
We're talking about Elon Musk for the avoidance of doubt.
Yes, Elon Musk.
Yeah.
And is also palsy with Putin, and it's reportedly someone who's had several phone calls with Putin in recent months. You have a
And reportedly, though denied,
reportedly.
at least one phone call since the election.
But of course, a lot of things are denied. For example, Musk is said to have met already with the Iranian ambassador to the United Nations. The Iranians deny it. The Wall Street Journal seems to have had good sourcing, although unnamed. So when you have this kind of foreign policy, and it all depends on the whimsical, erratic thinking of one person who is willing to jettison alliances, to basically pull the teeth out of NATO, make Article 5 irrelevant, and accede to a deal with Russia that basically betrays, sacrifices Ukraine.
And should we, since we've got that, I mean, and because Ukraine is actually quite a good lens to look at America's allies, I'd love you, Trudy, just to reflect on, I mean, something which was clearly, as it were, not the first choice that President Zelensky would have made if he had a vote in this election. Just give us a sense of you know, if Europe were to step forward and to attempt without significant American help or with much reduced American help to support Ukraine in the defense of its territory, would that be likely to be effective? To what extent would an early Trump peace initiative be likely to lead to success? Obviously, it depends on the terms that he sets out and so on. So when you think about whether Ukraine, in the light of this a political event in the United States, where have you got to on that?
I should say that I've made several long trips to Ukraine since 2022, and I was just there in June and was on the front and interviewed Zelensky and the head of military intelligence and a lot of commanders on the front. And the answer to whether Europe can do it alone is no. And when you talk to leaders in the Baltics or in Poland, they are aghast at leaving it to Europe, because what is already obvious is that Europe is unable to standardize its defense procurement and manufacturing. It has talked about it for 20 years. It has not happened, even under the pressure of the war in Ukraine. So you have countries, many of whom are in economic difficulty right now: Germany, France, and Britain, although Britain has been very forward-leaning on Ukraine. But they simply can't coordinate. They need to increase massively defense production, and they're not doing it, and they don't have the manufacturing heft to make up the difference. And they need U.S. leadership, because otherwise they go in divergent directions, which is encouraged by Russia with money and other means. As far as the so-called peace negotiations, what Trump has put forward totally indicates his complete misunderstanding of what Putin wants and what is at stake in Ukraine. Putin has made absolutely clear in speeches from 2007 at the Munich Security Forum and over since that he is furious at the dissolution of the Soviet Empire, and that he wants to rebuild it in the guise of the historic Russian Empire. And so he has also made clear that he is unwilling to give up any territory, and in order for any peace settlement, that territory has to be recognized as Russian. Then you have a president who has said he believes Putin over U.S. intelligence, and you see the disrespect that he is already showing for U.S. intelligence. So what Trump refuses to recognize is that this is not a territorial dispute over carving up land. it is a dispute over annexation and expansion. And if Ukraine is divided, it will have no security, because the only way you could divide it is if you had a deal like East and West Germany or the two Koreas, where the U.S. guaranteed the half that was the 3/4 or 4/5 that was westward leaning. If there is no guarantee, then Russia will use this break to invade again sooner or later, and Ukraine will be bankrupt because no one will invest in a Ukraine that is partitioned and has no security guarantees.
But Trudy, couldn't you make the case that under Joe Biden and American stronger leadership, but with, frankly, a limited permission given to Ukraine to strike strategically into Russia, for example, and a limit to the amount of materiel that they're going to get, that Ukraine is losing the war by inches at the moment, and before the election, domestic confidence and support for the war in Ukraine was itself falling, with little indication that under a Democratic president, America was prepared, in a sense, to raise support to the level where victory might have been possible. And, I mean, some kind of negotiation, I'm asking this as a question rather than a personal point of view, that some kind of negotiated settlement which would have involved some kind of acceptance of at least some of the occupied territory, perhaps Crimea, perhaps parts of the Donbass, would almost certainly, in back here on planet Earth, as it were, have to be negotiated. So, in other words, that the end of this might well be anyway, have been a negotiated settlement.
The only way you could have had an effective negotiating settlement is if Putin was on the back foot. In other words, if he realized that it was worse in terms of domestic politics for him to continue, and therefore had to, through his propaganda mill, tell his people, we've gotten what we wanted, we're going home. That was never going to happen. It's not going to happen now. If there were a possibility of a territorial compromise, as I said, you would have to have a guarantee by the West that the rest of Ukraine would be protected. And that is not on offer. What is on offer?
Not an offer specifically from the Trump administration.
It wasn't on offer from the Biden administration either, because Biden opposed letting Ukraine into NATO. So I think what's critical here is the recognition of what the loss of Ukraine would mean in geopolitical terms. I don't think that Trump has any interest in recognizing that. The Europeans understand it. They understand that it would undermine NATO to the point where nobody believed in NATO anymore because NATO powers have supported Ukraine. I just want to say one thing about Joe Biden as well. I mean, I've been going to Ukraine since the beginning of the invasion. What has happened is too little too late. I think Joe Biden deserves a huge amount of credit for recognizing that Ukraine could not just be sacrificed, and that looked at the geopolitical realities. But at each step, the critical weapons that were promised were delivered much too late, and sometimes have not been delivered yet. For example, F-16s, only a handful, which is virtually useless. The Europeans have been willing to deliver a vast number of F-16s for months, even years, and the Biden White House has not prioritized pilot training. So there's no pilots, and has not encouraged them, and in fact has discouraged them. So over and over, the intention and understanding of the Biden team was not backed up by the weapons that I believe could have put Ukraine in a position to negotiate by now. What Trump proposes is simply a cover story for handing Ukraine over to Russia.
Okay. Now, I'm asking them to make sure that at the coffee break we've also got some scotch and gin available for those who need it, because we haven't finished yet. I want to come back to NATO in a moment, but I just wonder whether more broadly, and we've got we also want to let the audience in fairly soon, but we have plenty to discuss and we won't get to everything. But I thought, given the events of the last week, and in particular, Trudy, as you mentioned, some of the controversial names that have both been rumoured, but also in many cases confirmed by the incoming administration in absolutely top jobs, and in many cases, mapping across parts of the federal government where, again, Mr. Trump, to be fair, made it very clear to the electorate that he believed that disruption and, in some ways, retribution were required. And I'm thinking of, it's a very broad, disparate group, and if you include parts of the, the health system, which RFK is now going to have a significant, obviously, role in, includes many things which directly touch on concerns of members here. But in particular, we might talk about the Federal Reserve and the kind of justice system, DOJ, FBI, intelligence services, and all the rest of it. And again, ideologically, or not, perhaps that's the wrong word, instinctively, Mr. Trump is someone who is clearly very skeptical about the kind of arm's length protections separating key legal decision makers, the Attorney General, for example, and the Department of Justice, or key agencies like the FBI, or indeed in monetary policy, the Federal Reserve, in the interests of objectivity, dealing with conflict of interest, and trying to get continuity of policy and treatment of people from administration to administration. Mr. Trump and his those around him read the Constitution as is in fact giving the president essentially, as people will know, there is no Attorney General mentioned in the Constitution, and the chief law officer of the United States is the president, not the Attorney General. And so the kind of central control and top-down control from the office of the leader of the country into these very sensitive parts of government seems to be a, as it were, coherent, thought through, and now carefully planned agenda. I just wonder, we begin with the Fed, Alan. Perhaps in some ways, I think it's, when you think about it, its foundational role in this country's economy is of immense importance. It's not quite as passionately debated, perhaps, as DOJ and FBI and so forth. But what's your sense about this, about how real the likelihood is of an attempt to bring the Fed to heel, to use one of the expressions that's been used?
There are a few things to say about that. First of all, as people in this audience probably know, but most people in America don't know, the Fed has no special constitutional protection. It is not in the Constitution. Probably Hamilton would have loved to have it in the Constitution, but he got his way on a number of things, but he didn't get his way on that. Poetically speaking, right over there is the second bank of the United States, which is what we had as our central bank. People didn't use that term so much in the 19th century until somebody named Andrew Jackson, who ironically sits on the $20 bill, abolished it by not extending its charter. And we then lived till 1914 as the only advanced economy in the world that didn't have a central bank. We could go back there. As I said, there's no constitutional protection. An ordinary law of Congress, passed by the both houses in the way they do, and signed by the president, which is up until next January 20th, has always been the fail-safe protection against craziness. could abolish the Fed or change it in any way. They could make it subservient to the White House. They could make it subservient to some committees of Congress or to the Senate in general. They can do anything if you get both houses of Congress and the president willing to sign it. Now, you asked before about inflation. There are quite a number of us economists have said if you actually look at Trump's package of economic policies, starting with tax cuts, going to tariffs, going to deporting, if you could imagine this, about 8% of our labor force or something like that. It's a little hard to imagine.
And specifically likely to be significantly at the cheap labor
Yeah.
end. So in other words, the combination of tariffs and exporting cheap labor is doubly inflationary, arguably.
Yeah, so the point I wanted to make is all those things are inflationary, ironically, after he ran on only I can fix the inflation or whatever. But all of that would be dwarfed by undermining the Federal Reserve. Sovereigns throughout millennia have clipped the currency in one way or another. Now they're not going to be grabbing silver and gold off the coins. But I often tell my students, we have this phrase, printing money. It's even easier now. It's printing electrons. Money is electrons, basically. And you give that power to print electrons to people that are subservient to Trump. And Trump wants to see. Trump's a real estate operator. Those people always want low interest rates, always. Doesn't matter if they're Republicans or Democrats. They always want low interest rates. So you combine that with his unwillingness to bow to or adhere to long-standing traditions. We have, I spoke a moment ago, we had no Federal Reserve till 1914, but we have had one since 1914. That's 110 years. To him, it doesn't matter. And if we're going, I believe we may wind up having to rely on the good judgment of the Congress. Yes, and that deserves a lot of laughs, to restrain him from doing that.
Because essentially, I mean, just you're clipping the currency point, the generic issue being that politicians, frankly, of any stripe, may often be strongly tempted to put short-term political objectives and an election coming up ahead of strategic control of the of money and of the economy, with in the end potentially catastrophic results. And
it's the realization of that have made countries around the world make their central banks independent in various and sundry degrees. And so, in many cases, it's actually in the Constitution, not in ours. But in almost all countries, there is a significant amount of independence granted to the central bank.
Yeah.
For that reason, for exactly that reason.
But do you think it's fair to say that actually one thing that was pretty clear, whoever had won last week, was that America's debt load was likely to continue to increase, that there was little appetite from either camp to begin. I mean,
that's right.
Can you? I mean, 4 years seems like a long time, but in the history of national debt, it's not that long. Can you envisage a political circumstance where governments, either Democrat or Republican, are going to begin to start winding down or trying to slow the rate at which the country's national debt is increasing? Or should we not worry about that? I mean, should we accept that America's got unique attributes, reserve currency and so forth, which means, and an extremely buoyant, strong economy, which means that maybe it's less of a worry than it will be in many other countries?
Starting with the last part of your question, the answer is that is resoundingly yes. We have what has been called an exorbitant privilege. And part of that exorbitant privilege is the ability to sell enormous amounts of debt in our own market. And we have a huge domestic market. You start with that. but also all over the world. Investors buy U.S. Treasury debt at still reasonable prices, right? We're no longer in that crazily low interest rate environment that we were in a few years ago. But if you look across history, the kinds of numbers that we have for interest rates on Treasury debt, 4%-ish numbers, this is not unusually high by any means. And we're a rich enough, big enough country that we can afford it. One thing people don't realize, actually, since you asked, in very recent years, there was a huge run-up in the national debt because of the various responses to COVID. But in recent years, the debt to GDP ratio, which you sort of alluded to there, has actually backed down a teeny bit, roughly constant. So it's not soaring anymore. When that is soaring, that's when economists start getting worried, like how much longer can this go on? But I must say on that question, how much longer can this go on, started being raised in the 80s and the 90s and the 2000s, and the answer was always apparently quite a bit longer.
Yeah.
So when I think about the perils that the country is facing now, just in the economic sphere, not to mention the legal sphere and the foreign policy spheres where it's worse, the size and growth, which, as I just said, it's not growing anymore right now, of the debt to GDP ratio is not high on my list.
Okay, and growth, by the way,
we're growing.
And will continue to grow under Trump, probably?
I think so. I mean, he has the capacity to really screw things up. I mean,
it's a gift.
Yeah. One thing that I only learned about I should have known this before, when Trump had his first term, is Congress years ago basically ceded the authority over tariffs to the president. The Constitution puts the taxing authority in the Congress, not in the White House. And the Congress just handed it to the president before Trump. And if you have a president who will declare a national emergency every time he sneezes, he can do anything with tariffs. And what he's already said he wants to do is horrific enough.
Okay. Now, can we turn to the justice system in the federal government, both the agencies and the DOJ itself, and the role of Attorney General. Again, I mean, this is so much, your discipline, your world, and you devoted your life to a significant part of your life to understanding justice. I'm interested in how resilient you think these institutions are. I mean, broadly, I think it's fair to say that Washington's institutions, including the Justice Department, were less damaged in the first Trump term, 16 to 20, than many people feared. And, although there may have been some passages where the independence of the DOJ certainly felt as if it was in grave danger, and there was some there was at least one very controversial AG. Nonetheless, the DOJ is still, has still been standing, and the DOJ of the Biden administration has not been so unlike the Biden administration of the Barack Obama administration. Do you think that resilience is likely to survive the second term, knowing what we know?
So the fundamental bedrock, I think, is the rule of law concept, right? Where there's an expectation that we'll be governed by laws and not by quote unquote men, that there will be orderly processes.
It was men.
Orderly processes, due process. There'll be impartial access to impartial adjudication, fair trials, and so forth. The rule of law, that's the bedrock, right? And one would expect the Justice Department, preeminently among American agencies, to be guided by these ideals, right? And so a couple of things could go crazy. One is that a president could successfully appoint leaders who are incompetent or who are highly partisan. And both of those two things are not good. And when they combine with one another, lack of competence and partisanship, we could have some pretty bad decisions coming out of the Justice Department, including decisions that are tailor-made to work to the advantage of the president. The president wants something, he's got the right people in charge, he appointed them, they do his bidding, and that's a bad thing. Think about the 70s and Nixon and Watergate and how troubled all sides were by what seemed to be happening with the president having undue influence over the attorney general and so forth. I long for those days. I long for those days. Because resilience. I mean, yeah, the institution still stands and the center still holds. But as you say, there's no constitutional necessity that we have some of the agencies that we actually they're not grounded in the Constitution, most of them, and so they can be changed, abolished, et cetera. We've got a layer of political leadership in all these agencies that we have to worry about being too much under the partial influence, a partisan influence of the president. And I think that so the bedrock, I think, is fairly resilient, but you can see how easy it is through political appointments in the judiciary branch.
And the American tradition wasn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, right from the founding of the Republic, was of, in stark contrast to some European countries. You take the UK and take a Department of State in the national government in the UK. There's a very, very thin layer of political appointments.
Yeah.
I mean, literally,
So
like
we've got a
1%.
layer of political appointments across all the agencies. You've got these career bureaucrats working underneath them, right? And so the winds of politics always affect what happens in this sort of band of.
But it seems like
it can be better or worse depending upon how much discretion and how much of the discretion and the customs that normally keep these things from crumbling are honored. And Trump is someone who's not respectful of his own power.
And very specifically, seems to want to take the political layer
Yes.
far, far deeper into these institutions.
Perhaps.
So,
yes.
I mean,
And combine that with the courts, which can be a kind of a watchdog over some of the decisions made by agencies. But we now see the courts are increasingly stacked with people who are appointed by Trump in order to achieve his objectives. And he's not shy about saying that he's picking people, not so much because of their judicial learnedness, but because they're people who share his political values and whom he thinks he can get to make decisions that support him. Our Constitution is open to interpretation, but there are better and worse interpretations, and there are fairer and less fair interpretations. I think that my fear is that the combination of a Trump-leaning judiciary with this political layer, which may be thickening, it spells very bad news for us for several generations.
And just while we're here, can I ask you, I mean, perhaps all three of you, a political question. So this is a political opinion question. One of the interesting things for the Democratic Party, as it is always for opposition to figures, Viktor Orban, and other populists everywhere, is how do you respond? Because the disruptive character of this kind of politics also is disruptive of opposition parties. It disrupts the rest of politics. And I've been very struck that, if you turn on, if you look at CNN.com or turn on CNN, you'll find this past week a lot of Democrat politicians and liberal commentators standing up to stoutly defend Washington institutions. So they're speaking up in favor of the DOJ and the FBI and their independence and how professional they are, and the Fed and so forth. And it's just worth saying, opinion polls suggest that these are some of the least popular institutions in America, and not just with Republicans. These are regarded as even by many Democrats. And so you take my point, which is for the Democrats, one risk is for a party which is meant to be a progressive party.
Yes.
Is it not the risk of the Democrats? Looks like they're the sort of defenders of the ancien regime, of the old order.
So there's this irony. It's so perfect. It's irony here, where the academics in the room will appreciate this. So we've been hearing for the last 5 years about this horrible thing called critical race theory. Right? So critical race theory is this horrible a belief that's perpetrated by law school professors and others, that the government is bad, that we need that the institutions to be torn down. So the right wing has been very anti-critical race theory, but ironically now they're the ones, that the right wing are the ones who are saying, no, government's bad. Government, we can't trust government, it's corrupt. So ironically, the very people who a few years ago were sort of criticizing the left for lacking respect for government are now the ones who lack respect for government. Wow. So strange.
So we're going to open it up for people. I'm going to ask one last thing, and then you get the first question. Again, I'm going to take you slightly away from well, you can use as much or as little of your expertise as you want in the answer, but let's imagine that the three of you are a committee to advise the Democratic Party on their next move. In other words, you have 2 years before the midterms. You do not have majorities in anywhere really at the moment in the federal government. Though you've got great strongholds, some great governors. There's lots of fundamental strength in the Democratic Party. Any first thoughts to advise Democrats on how they should be regrouping, replanning, resurging over the next couple of years? And I can start with anyone who's ready. It's kind of deathly hush. Go on, Trudy.
Well, two things come to mind immediately. Obviously, if we all survive to the midterms, it's critical that the Democrats do better and take back one or both of the houses. And I think a role model to look at is Elissa Slotkin in Michigan, who narrowly pulled out a win there, she was a fabulous congresswoman, and she'll make a terrific senator. But what she did, she had a lot of national security background at Defense Department, the CIA. But she did what Kamala Harris apparently couldn't do. She pulled out the specifics from the stimulus bill and from the infrastructure bill to show each area of Michigan what they had gained. Because those bills are so broadly labeled, you wouldn't even know that they invested in new factories, that they created new jobs in Michigan, which Trump did not do, although he promised. And every bridge, every road, she specified. And by campaigning on what the Democrats did for you and would do for you, and I think in 2 years it will be easier if, God forbid, we have new polio epidemics or measles epidemics, thanks to RFK Jr., if we have disasters overseas, which everyone will be able to see, and if we have other catastrophes that you can imagine from the people that he's picking. So that's one thing. Focus on how you're going to campaign. And I do think the focus has to be on the center. I think right now, a lot of progressive issues are niche issues, and the focus has to be on main issues: housing, health, economy, to the max, and what the Democrats can do that the Republicans will not do. especially on tax bills, showing what you get if you're below this income and what you get if you're a billionaire. Also a focus on oligarchs. This is becoming a country of oligarchs. We are becoming more like Russia rather than Russia becoming more like us, as was hoped for in the 90s. Well, that's one suggestion. Maybe other people have.
Alan.
I basically agree with that. Sliding it over into the economic, same ideas into the economic realm. 2 points. If you go down the line of issue, most of the public actually favors the Democratic side, and they were hornswoggled, or what I really think is they voted not on economic issues, on cultural issues and things like that. So they're on the right side. The Democrats need to message this a lot better. They're not going to get this from the likes of us academic economists. But there are people that do this for a living badly. We need some people that do this for a living well. And there are such people, I hope. Second thing, also related to what Trudy just said, the passage of time should be on our side. No matter what Trump said during the campaign, tariffs will raise prices of goods for ordinary Americans. And they will start seeing, he has a lot of authority over that. He can do that quickly, and I believe he will. And people are going to notice that in Walmart and Costco and other places like that. It's about goods, not about services. And another thing is that lower income people have a bigger share of their budget in goods, and higher income people have a bigger share of their budget in services. So it'll be the lower income people that feel this more, and they will feel it. The other place where it may or may not actually blow up in people's faces, because it's going to take more time, and I don't have at all a good vision of how he's going to do it, is the mass deportations of 11 million people. My suspicion is this is going to take forever, and people will only have seen a tiny bit of this by the time 2 years. But maybe I'm wrong. I don't say that with any great confidence.
Yeah.
So we don't know how much of that is going to be seen by the people and how revolted they are by seeing concentration camps in American soil.
Well, just one quick thing, too. If he succeeds, it will have a dramatic effect on food production because all the chicken pluckers, field workers, people that are doing jobs that Americans don't want to do will go home. Yeah. Just as in England after Brexit, all the Polish plumbers went home. And the National Health Service was denuded of all its subsidiary staff. It will be felt here if he actually does what he pledges.
Okay, Anita, lastly.
Remember how when Hillary lost, one of the popular views among people like us about why she lost was that, she and the rest of us weren't paying enough attention to the lower middle class white people, you know, that we need to, be focused on that group. And neither one of you said that, right? None said that, we lost these people, we need to get those people. But I think, so I agree with everything you guys said. I just wonder, what happened to that narrative about, we got to somehow be more empathetic towards, be more understanding of, because but so one thing. So I was struck by when Kamala first was announced, how very attractive Democrats came out of the walls in her support. You thought, we do have talent. There is talent in the Democratic Party. There are people who have appeal and who have leadership potential that we could do more with, and they could do more for us and with us. So I think that one of the things that we need to be thinking about is like building and utilizing the strong Democratic leaders that are there who could be elevated, as Kamala was elevated, and she did a fantastic job. So I think we should sort of use our leadership more as Democrats. But I would also say this: you ask us to role play, like pretend you're a Democratic strategist. Well, ask me to pretend to be a law professor.
Okay.
Okay. Okay.
Done.
So the hardest thing for me right now in the actual role that I have is being a law professor at an elite American law school with brilliant students, and I'm supposed to be teaching them to respect and use the law for good. And yet they're in a climate where that doesn't seem to be the way the world works. So what am I supposed to teach my students? How to be liars, how to manipulate, how to seek judicial appointments by being suck-ups to extremists. I mean, seriously. This is a serious problem. 7 years ago, I was invited by the University of Haifa in Israel to come as a consultant to help them with their problem of how do you teach law in a law school in Israel that serves Jewish students who are ultra-Orthodox and conservative and not religious, and also you have to teach Palestinians who may be Christians and who may be Muslims. How do you do all that when the very Constitution is contested? How do you do that? But they saw it as a profound problem requiring outside expertise, and we went there, a group of 8, and we went all around the country. But the same thing now is our problem, which is how do we teach law when the very foundation of our country is under attack and may be crumbling? It's a serious problem.
Yeah.
Can I just add one thing quickly? I think what you said is so important, and before we were talking about the generations in which we grew up. If you grew up, if you're a baby boomer or past a baby boomer, but still close enough, so your parents were in World War II, you recognize, you were brought up to believe that the U.S. was the city on the hill and ask not what you can do for your country. Students now are more cynical. Everyone is more cynical among the younger generation, or most. And I think that's one of the problems we have to come to grips with. We don't do civic education, and if we do, nobody pays attention. The question is, how can you recreate idealism among the younger generation?
Okay, let's go to the hall now, please.
Thank you, Mark, and the panelists for an excellent session. I'm Nina Jablonski from State College, Pennsylvania. It's clear that the winner in this election was a master manipulator of emotions, and that there was a fairly wholesale rejection of facts, whether it be about justice or economics or other in foreign policy, certainly. And facts really had almost no place, ultimately, in decision-making. My questions to you are, how do you see this emotional journey playing out? The emotional salience of the Trump message is significant. It's been brought through in his rallies. How do you see this playing out when we don't have the theater of rallies anymore, and when we're counting on different modes of media to provide this emotional manipulation? And then the other side of this is, what is the trajectory for a fact-based decision-making apparatus in this country?
And super brief answers. So, and with questions as easy as that, it shouldn't be hard.
I think this is one of the most important questions of our age, and right now we don't know the answer, but the media ecosystem that trumpets conspiracy theories is the media ecosystem that's on the rise. And facts are resisted. Luke 23:34, and it's a big reason for Luke. And I think that the other side of the information aisle has to figure out not only how to present facts so that people will read them, but to survive. And we had a good billionaire with the Philadelphia Inquirer who saved us. I don't know if billionaires are the answer, but I think this is the question we all have to discuss, because the possibility for fact-based discourse is crumbling, and it's what we have to look at reviving, whether it's with civic society groups with founding new kinds of online operations that counteract the cesspool of Twitter, et cetera, et cetera. But facts have to be saved, and I don't know if they can be, and it's what everyone has to be thinking about.
Okay, I don't know if we've got any good billionaires who want to ask a question here, but if not, I'll take this one.
I thank you for, sorry, I have a difficulty change my kinematic configuration.
Yeah, close to the...
Thank you for your comment about civility and morality and teaching. I grew up under Hitler. So one of the things what America has to know that what this dictatorship offers is lack of personal freedom. I mean, I remember that we as children, we were afraid to say, or the parents were afraid to say anything, so that it doesn't come out that how the parents are thinking. Then I lived under Stalin. Same thing. People, colleagues, students were making notes about what I said and what I didn't say, and reported. After the wall came down, I saw those reports. So the private privacy is really here in danger. So I understand the economics that drives us, many of the Americans, but this is perhaps even more fundamental.
Thank you very much. Anita, do you want to respond to that? It's a real focus
so
of yours.
I have spent a decade studying privacy and data protection in the United States, and you're absolutely right that one of the concerns that we have is what will government do with our information, right? And you had the great misfortune of living under Hitler and Stalin. I can't even imagine how horrible that must have been, and I'm so glad to see you here today. But we do have to worry about government data collection, and everything from will the government get access to our health records and then judge us and punish us for getting abortions and so forth. But also, as you say, just collecting our political opinions. Will somehow the schools become tools of this sort of tyranny and begin to monitor students' opinions and collect their data, and then so it's a huge problem, and it's really the Orwellian problem, right, that we haven't talked about today. But I understand that concern, and I share it.
And China is doing it already.
Yeah.
Everybody has a scorecard.
Yeah.
Let us hope we never get there.
Exactly, social scoring is a
If
very
I could
big
just
deal.
add one sentence. I prophesied, I think it was largely correct in 2016, that Trump's economic policies would be terrible, but everything else would be worse.
Very good. Now, by the way, if someone has a point or a question, which is from a conservative background, which is, and we've had obviously with our panel here, people who broadly, explained disappointment with the result and some of the grave dangers they think flow from it. But I'm very interested in other perspectives. But I'm not suggesting that you've got one, sir. But we'll take you next.
Yeah, Rich Schiffer in Indiana. Since time is running out, I'd like to introduce a note of good news into this litany of horrors.
Yeah.
In the next 4 years, the FBI and the CIA will not be investigating APS and its sister institutions, mainly because they know we don't matter.
Bravo. Howard has got a question over there.
Hi, Howard Gardner from Cambridge. Thanks, everybody. A terrific panel. Most of us here are old, and we're pretty conservative, except politically. But at a few times in American history, there has been a third party that's emerged. And if you had a bunch of young people who are age of 25 or 30, who know how to maneuver the influence panels, and wanted to launch, as I guess Macron did, in a sense, a new political party, not just running for president, because that won't work, but having people emerge like them across the 50 states. Is this totally a pipe dream, or maybe, quoting Gary Gerstle, we've been through the New Deal, we've been through neoliberalism, we need to have a new undercurrent of thought in this country at this time?
I mean, it wouldn't be a horrible idea to have more parties.
It's so hard for a third party to get established. And if there were to be one, I think the only third party that might make a difference is a centrist third party, where people realign from the current parties. But a party that was founded by youth, it wouldn't have the money, it wouldn't have necessarily the issue, it wouldn't be able to get on the ballots, which costs millions of dollars, and it would basically drain, as Jill Stein drained, votes from the Democrats, no doubt.
There's a very difficult balancing act, isn't there? I mean, the story in the United Kingdom, when Margaret Thatcher got elected shortly thereafter, there was a breakaway party from the Labour Party, the Social Democratic Party. We already had a Liberal Party, and in the broader sense, the left-hand side of the political ledger spent essentially 17, 18 years figuring out the future, which basically was a realignment around the Labour Party. So after this long exercise, nearly two decades of Conservative rule, simply because the left was divided and votes amongst the left were divided, which in the UK system meant they didn't get into power. So there are, although...
And it's much harder in our system than in a parliamentary system.
It's even harder. It's even harder here. And
I want to get one sentence in. Yeah. The answer to your question, Howard, is yes, it's a pipe dream, but the MAGA party took over the Republican Party. This is not the Republican Party that we grew up with at all. It's a new party.
And in a way, you might say that therefore the right response is to try, if you want to change politics somewhat, perhaps opposition politics, perhaps to do it, if you can, effectively within the existing Democratic Party rather than
with
outside
new
it.
leaders.
Right. But there'd be also this concern that you then might have a winner who only has, as Clinton did in his first term, 43% of the popular vote, and he didn't have a strong mandate, which made his first term extremely difficult for him to get anything done.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, please.
Hi, Joe Soler from Philadelphia. You were speaking about the decline of facts. And when I think about the media, and the cats and dogs story, for example, is the very act of fact-checking publicly actually backfiring? Because first you repeat the lie, and you repeat the lie, and you repeat the lie.
There's actually some evidence that that's the case. Interesting enough. I think the media has to be careful about essentially virtue signaling around fake news, and to signal to people who probably wouldn't be taken in by the fake news that you take fake news seriously. But there is some evidence that fact-checking and otherwise calling out fake news tends to help it propagate. Which is a bit of a puzzle, really, if you think about it, because the idea of not calling it out is I think, in some ways intolerable. I do think that chasing down these urban myths, which is what the cats and dogs really is, to their original, like a single incident somewhere near the town in question in Ohio, is quite useful and quite interesting to almost explain to people where essentially myths and legends come from. They're very seldom literally invented. They're normally some gloriously, to be fair, Marjorie Taylor Greene's Rothschild space lasers probably is just invented, but generally there's some twisted version of some weird single one-off incident. But it's a real puzzle, and I think that, as it were, virtue signaling, doing things because it feels culturally appropriate in your institution or anything, is a risk. At the same time, some stuff you just can't let pass, I don't think, without it looking like you're to everyone as if you're colluding in it. So it's an issue.
Quick sentence, as the other journalist on the panel. I think in this dilemma, you come up against the question of whether facts can survive. And so I think even if it seems a losing proposition, for example, with Trump's lies, if you don't have on record what truth is, you've almost admitted that the liars have won. And so I think that it's necessary for the record and hopefully for the future to keep on with the worst of those lies and conspiracy theories. For example, with Tulsi Gabbard, you cannot not bring it up, and sometimes you can win.
Yeah, and the way I think is, I mean, the facts always win. The facts in the end always win. But what I mean is reality wins. In other words, that eventually, this can take years, you're shaking your head, in the end, something, a significant true thing about the US economy or about international relations gets out. Our issue, I'll come to you, yes. Our issue is the early communication of them and getting public to believe in them, as it were, before it's too late for the underlying facts to happen. So global warming is a fact which is going to happen. The issue is, can enough people be persuaded it's going to happen in time to react to it in time?
Well, many of us here teach undergraduates. And one of the things I've learned in the last few years teaching undergraduates is they don't read. And they certainly don't read anything you guys write. So you talk about facts, they have a very different relationship to facts. They have stuff that lives in their phone, but they don't distinguish between the valence of the things that live in their phones. So everything you guys have said is completely correct for those of us who are over 60, and it's completely irrelevant to the people who are 20, on average. And obviously there are some exceptional students, but we all work at exceptional institutions, and we all have students who don't read, and they don't do arithmetic either.
Well, I mean, my husband, who's in the room, he and I have taught together undergraduates at Penn, and he would totally agree with you. They don't read, but they are gathering information from their phone, and they're creating information and putting it into their phones, and they're creating communities around what they think might be a fact, or that they are believing it is a fact. Their news comes from social media, so they are reading. They're not reading the New York Times necessarily, but they're reading something, and they're learning something. And we need, and the Democratic Party actually needs to get more into that world of social media. I mean, you called it the Twitter. What did you call it? The Twitter?
Well, opposing the Twitter world.
Yes, we need to get. I mean, not just opposing it, but to learn how to use it.
Yeah.
To make facts rise up. I mean, you said this marketplace of ideas kind of a thing. Like, it's very idealistic. It's very, John Stuart Mill, all that good stuff. And I think that there's something to that. Oftentimes, truth does rise up, but sometimes it doesn't. It gets tamped down and stays down.
Yeah. These people are desperate for coffee, at least.
Yeah. So am I.
But just to say, this is such a good point. I mean, but the point is, the marketplace for ideas right now for many young people is, are platforms like TikTok. And by the way, we had one of my colleagues at CNN, David Culver, did a really amazing film inside a super prison in El Salvador, a place which, by the way, might receive deported illegal immigrants from the United States. So this thing, we dropped it onto multiple platforms, but particularly TikTok on a Thursday afternoon. By Friday morning, it had been viewed 15 million times. 15 million times. This is a piece of, if you like, coverage of a foreign country. There's something, this may also be something for political parties to think about.
Yeah.
There are ways of connecting with audiences who are below the age of 60, below the age of 30 even, but it's not going to be with conventional op-ed pieces or conventional breaking news from Wolf Blitzer sort of thing. It's going to be different pathways. Now, I think we probably ought to stop there. Can we thank everyone?
Thank you.
It's good. Good.
Obviously, no one wanted to stop. Thank you so much. Coffee in the back and the front.
Welcome back, everybody. If you could gradually take your seats. Thank you, everyone, for getting back to your seats. Thank you, colleagues. Thank you, friends. And welcome back after, I hope, a refreshing break. Everyone clearly is more excited than they usually are in a Saturday morning APS session. I hope you've all done your deep breathing exercises during the break. And really, after that wonderful and expansive discussion about the recent US presidential election, I'm delighted to introduce our next speaker, Moon Duchin, a mathematician who uses math to defend democracy. Moon Duchin is a professor of mathematics and public policy at Cornell University. Her lab builds mathematical models for the study of democracy, including through algorithm design, systems modeling, and improved measurements of fairness and electoral opportunity. In this cycle, Professor Duchin has served as an expert witness in voting rights cases in 7 states and has advised governments and commissions in numerous others, including here in Pennsylvania. Her work has been honored with a Guggenheim Fellowship and a Radcliffe Fellowship, and she is a Fellow of the American Mathematical Society. Please join me in welcoming to the stage of the APS, Moon Duchin.
Slides may happen.
Now that we've been all sobered up to our geography lesson in a very salutary way, I have the great pleasure of introducing the last session of the day and the lecture by Dava Sobel. One of the most influential science writers of our time, Dava Sobel is the author of the international bestseller Longitude and the best-selling Pulitzer Prize finalist book Galileo's Daughter, among others. She is the recipient of the Individual Public Service Award from the National Science Board, the Bradford Washburn Award, the Kumke-Roberts Award from the Astronomical Society of the Pacific, and a Guggenheim Fellowship, among many other honors. A former New York Times science reporter, Ms. Sobel is currently the editor of the Meter poetry column in Scientific American. She joins us now to discuss her latest book, The Elements of Marie Curie, a biography of APS member Marie Curie, who was inducted into the Society in May 1921. Please join us in welcoming Dava Sobel to the stage.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Excuse me for having my coat on, but I think my blood just runs cold from some of these discussions, and I just cannot warm up. So I came to Philadelphia to talk to the APS about my new book, about Madame Curie, and the first thing that happened was that I had an encounter with Madame Curie, unlike any I've had in the years I spent writing this book. That thanks to a meeting with Michelle McDonald and Adriana Link, I saw the APS holdings that pertain to Madame Curie. And they include 2 handwritten letters from her. I was right there with those letters. The whole time I was writing the book, the pandemic kept me from the actual materials. But because Madame Curie is Madame Curie, everything of hers has been digitized, including lab notebooks, letters, the journal of her grief that she kept the year after her husband died, in which she actually spoke to him, the notebook in which she recorded the developmental accomplishments, landmarks of her 2 children. All of these things are available online. So I was hardly limited in the variety of material, but to see her actual letter was a real thrill. So these letters both came from 1910, the year she was inducted. And the first one is dated May, and it is her thank you to the organization for making her a member. So you might wonder, what had she done by 1910 that made her attractive to this organization? Well, she'd already won a Nobel Prize in physics. That might have been enough right there. But she had, through her doctoral dissertation work and what followed from that, she and her husband had discovered 2 new elements. Because at the time she was working, the periodic table was still a work in progress with holes to be filled. And so they had discovered 2 elements, and they had explored this new science of radioactivity, which was her word. She coined that term to describe what was originally called uranic rays, a kind of radiation that came out of uranium and compounds containing uranium. And she showed that, first of all, by testing all the known elements, that there was only one other known element that emitted these rays. And when she found materials that were emitting the rays, beyond what uranium or thorium could explain, she reasoned that must mean there's another new element that is radioactive. And if I try hard enough to break down the ore, I could find it. And that's what she did, twice. So, as I said, she worked with her husband. They shared the 1903 Nobel Prize in Physics with Henri Becquerel. She was the first woman to win a Nobel Prize in any category, which made her instantly world famous. Then, in 1906, when her husband was killed in an accident, she was selected by the faculty in Paris to take over the laboratory where they had worked together and to take over the teaching of his physics course. So she was the first woman to teach at this ancient university. So now she's doubly, triply famous, and certainly an attractive candidate for membership in the APS. So she thought enough to thank the organization in this handwritten letter. She did not have a secretary. By 1910, she had already started to do what interested me about Madame Curie, and that is to allow other women into the lab. So she's in charge now. She's world famous. Other women scientists all over the world see her as a magnet and this exciting new subject matter. So women started to come to her, to find their way to Paris. She didn't have to go hunt for them. All she had to do was not say no. And by 1910, she had 4 other women who were already working in her laboratory. So although she's the most famous woman in the history of science, she was never the only one, and she didn't want to be. Her second letter in the APS holdings, also from 1910, is dated toward the end of the year, when she was a candidate for election to the French Academy of Sciences, which, unlike the APS, had never admitted a woman. They had what they called immutable tradition. But her supporters felt that her distinctions, her achievements, were enough to overcome immutable tradition. And they put her name forward. And apparently she had some correspondence with the APS to gain support for her candidacy. So again, it was a thank you. Late in 1910. The vote was held in January of 1911, and she lost. This was such, talk about an election with embarrassing, maybe not as widespread, disastrous results, but it was really embarrassing. Here she is a pioneer in this field. But now, because she's not a member of the Academy, she cannot present the research results of her laboratory to the scientific community in the country. That's what it meant. So she has to continue doing what she's been doing, which is to go to a fellow faculty member and say, would you please read my paper at the next meeting, and so that it can be published in the proceedings. And that's what had to be done. And one of her reactions to that unfairness was that she stopped presenting at meetings. She stopped having the results from her lab presented at the meetings, and she published them elsewhere. The next document in the APS holdings relevant to Madame Curie is not a letter of hers, but a letter from a German scientist who happened to attend the first ever Solvay Council, which was held in Brussels in late October of 1911. So this was an invitation-only meeting of the top physicists in the world. About 25 people would come together in a room and talk about the enormous challenges in the field. So radioactivity has been accepted now. People agree that elements actually change from one into another. This is not the alchemist's transmutation, but a bona fide natural scientific process is going on. Radioactivity is hinting at the structure of the atom. At the beginning, there was even disagreement about whether the atom was a viable model. The quantum physics, Albert Einstein was at this meeting. Ernest Rutherford was at the meeting. It was an extraordinary gathering of minds. She was, of course, the only woman in the room. The day the meeting ended, reports erupted in the popular press about a romance in the laboratory between Madame Curie and another participant in this meeting, Paul Langevin. And it was a giant scandal, a very embarrassing turn of events. And so this letter in German referred to the Solvay Council and said how she was much a focus of attention. But the letter was dated, I believe, November 18th, which means that it was written after this whole scandal broke, and a scandal in which Albert Einstein came to her defense. In the midst of all of this hubbub, on November 7th, her birthday, she discovers she has won a second Nobel Prize, this time in chemistry. And it's hers alone, not shared with anyone. She remains, to this day, the only person ever to have won in both physics and chemistry. So she was overwhelmed what to do about this in the midst of her scandal, and she offered not to come to the ceremony. And they assured her that no one believed this libel being printed about her. But between early November and December, when the prize ceremony is held, there was a lot more flap in the press and a couple of duels fought over it. So they really didn't want her to come and wrote to suggest that she absent herself from the award ceremony. And she just gathered herself together and said that I failed to see what scurrilous attacks on my private life have to do with the merit of my scientific research. And she showed up in Stockholm, and she collected her prize. So the next document is dated, I believe, May in 1921, when she came here because she recovered her reputation by becoming a war hero. At the outbreak of the First World War, she immediately realized this would be the first time it would be possible to X-ray wounded soldiers. So she got someone to give her a car. She didn't even know how to drive. She got a car, and she outfitted it
with X-ray equipment and drove it to the front. And got her 17-year-old daughter to participate in this work. And then, because the need was so great, she put together a 6-week course for French women. They didn't have to be interested in science. They just had to have a basic education. Take my 6-week course. I teach you about electricity and X-rays and human anatomy, and then you can go out and do this work. She trained 150 women to do that work. And by the 1920s, she had many more women and men working in her lab. And she had turned the embarrassingly ill-equipped laboratory that she had shared with Pierre. I mean, one scientist who visited said it looked like a cross between a stable and a root cellar. And they couldn't believe that the work they had done had come out of that place. And now she was the head of an internationally recognized radium institute that was divided into 2 parts. So one part was the basic research and the production of these materials, which was her part. And then there was the medical part, because radium, it turned out, was the cure for cancer. So she is now lauded all over the world as a great humanitarian. And an American newspaper editor went to visit her in Paris and realized, for any number of reasons, Madame Curie didn't have enough radium to do her work. And so this woman, whose name was Marie Mattingly Maloney, went back to the United States and raised $100,000, which was the cost of a gram of radium, from the women of America. And they invited Madame Curie and her 2 daughters to come to this country. They arranged for her to collect honorary degrees from Smith and Pennsylvania, numerous places. They wore her out. She was a petite, frail woman. If you consider her X-ray exposure during the war, if you have dental X-rays, they put a lead blanket on you when the dentist walks out of the room. She was wearing a cotton smock. So they came here, and of course she was a member of the APS. So she came to a meeting, and they gave her the Benjamin Franklin Medal. And she talked a little bit about her work. And so the minutes of the meeting contain a description and interpretation of what she said. I think if you know what she actually did and you read the minutes, you can put it together. But it isn't really a great description, whereas her descriptions are terrific. She wrote with great clarity. In fact, in 1910, when she was inducted, she had written an important 2-volume textbook on radioactivity, which included the work of all the scientists in that field, not just her work. So she really was here. And my interest in her really was not to write a full biography. There are several biographies of Madame Curie. Probably many of you have read at least one of them. The first one was written by her younger daughter. It came out in the 1930s and was turned into a movie starring Greer Garson as Madame Curie. But what got me interested was the discovery that about 45 women had passed through her laboratory, which is something that is not covered in any of the biographies. And that was my story. And it was my story because of what happened to me writing my previous book, The Glass Universe, during which I was constantly surprised by what the women scientists had done. And I finally had to admit
that having grown up in the 1950s, I had absorbed a kind of misogyny, a lethal discounting of women. And it was awful to realize that. And then it was even more awful to discover I wasn't alone. I had asked Alyssa Goodman, who was a professor of astronomy at Harvard, to be one of my technical reviewers. And as she started reading the book, she said, "I'm sorry, I'm not really paying attention to your science descriptions. I am gobsmacked by these women. Here I am at Harvard. I know all their names. I know this story. But I always thought they were doing something cute or quaint. I never realized they were actually doing science." So there it was again. And I thought, wow, if the two of us have this kind of misogyny, how widespread is it? And I think after last Tuesday, we have our answer. So, all right. Concludes my remarks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
After that inspiring presentation about an exemplary APS member, I hope there are some questions for Dava.
There's one.
There we go, right there. Please give your name and place.
Betty Ruth Walter, University of Pennsylvania, Philadelphia. And she is always referred to as Madame Curie. She had many advanced degrees.
Yes, she
Any
did.
other male professor would have been professor or doctor. Was she ever addressed or considered other than Madame Curie?
She was, but she went by that title voluntarily. She also used her maiden name, Sklodowska, so she signed some things, Marie Sklodowska Curie, but her textbook is signed Madame Pierre Curie, and she used Pierre's picture as the illustration, not her own. I'm sorry, I don't
Yes.
see where.
Yes.
Oh, on the balcony.
Please name and place.
Louise Hanson. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
I live on Long Island. I had been at Brookhaven National Laboratory. I was wondering what languages, for instance, her private notebook that you said has been translated, or the letters that were sent to the APS, where anything, I mean,
They're in French.
They're all in
Everything
French.
is in French.
Everything.
Yes.
She didn't
Yes.
write notes in
it's
Polish.
digitized. She wrote in Polish to her family. But those letters to her family appear in the original biography. And I believe that during the Second World War, the originals were all lost. So I think the only record of most of that is in Eve Curie's book, which is called Madame Curie. Another.
Yes. So my mother, in fact, was very inspired by that book.
I learned yesterday from John Mather that Senator Barbara Mikulski was also inspired by that book. Some other people I could name, Angela Merkel and Fabiola Giannotti at CERN, who actually had to choose between a career in music or in physics, and because of Madame Curie, chose physics.
Other questions? We have time. I have one while we await others. Dava, I was, as a 9-year-old girl, reading a biography of Marie Curie, which was incredibly inspirational. Do you know how many biographies have been written? Because I think she was a mainstay of public libraries for young women and young men in the late 50s and 60s. And I wonder, has this continued, this growth of almost hagiography.
Yes, there have been more. Have I made a count? I know I've read them all. There are probably 12 or 15, and they're not all positive. People take shots at her. You know, it's a all too familiar trope that women do a different kind of science. Women do the boring, repetitive things, and the men just have aha moments. And she is accused of that. She is accused of using her hands but not her head.
Are we going? Yes, there we go. In the back, please.
Dava, can you talk a little bit about the number of women, if you will, who have won Nobel Prizes subsequent to Marie and Iran, and the incidence of that happening, you know, over the course of the last 100 years?
Yes, this is my editor, publisher, George Gibson, who has a family, wonderful historical ties to the APS. Very few women have won Nobel Prizes in the sciences. The second woman to win the Nobel Prize in chemistry was Irene Curie, who had followed her parents into the lab, like her mother, married her lab partner, and found great success. There wasn't another one for a long time. And I forget the exact numbers because, you know, I'm not young, I'm not running for president, and statistics don't, but I have to share with you, I am 77, which is the atomic number of iridium. And I like this age because of all the metals, iridium is the least susceptible to corrosion.
That's lovely.
So there are only about, there's maybe 7 chemists and 8 physicists altogether. And some women have won in medicine, including Kathleen Carrico, whose wonderful book, Breaking Through, I read recently and can highly recommend.
There actually were 10. 10 altogether.
10 altogether.
10 altogether, chemistry and physics. And
Thank you for correcting me, as you so often do.
Right at the back of the room. Name and place, please.
I'm Ruth Schwartz-Cowan. I'm from Irvington, New York. It cannot still be the case that there are no women admitted to the French Academy of Sciences. So when did the first one get admitted?
Yeah, well,
And
the
who
first
was it?
one was one of the people she had hired in her lab, Marguerite Perret. But that didn't happen till the 1940s. And it was a quasi-membership. She was in a kind of honorary position. She couldn't really vote. And the first real one, Yvette, I'm sorry. I have it in my book. I'll look it up for you and tell you later. And that came much later. And she was a physicist at the Pierre and Marie Curie University. So it was dramatic. But it took a long time. Irene Curie actively tried 3 times. She applied and never got in.
One quick last question up here.
All right, Mary Beth Norton, Ithaca, New York. I am, one of my hats is as a historian of women, and I was very struck by your comment about finally recognizing how many women had been completely ignored. And my reaction to that is it's a revelation that comes to us all, because it came to me at one point years ago, and it's come to many others, and I was appreciated your comment. And the other comment I had has to do with the marvelous Rosalind Franklin, completely ignored because of doing dull, boring work and not ever credited with her work for DNA. And I just wonder if you see that as another example of the sort of thing you're talking about.
Well, I think Rosalind Franklin has been recognized, loudly recognized. Now she has, yeah. At the time, not, yeah. Yeah, it's an all too familiar story. The women's names disappear. They fall off the published papers. They don't appear on the prize citations. It's been going on a very long time. Do I know what to do about it? No. The only thing I know how to do is write. So I'll just keep doing that and hope it has some. And I saw things in the collections that really interested me. I didn't come here with an idea for a new project, but now I think I might have one. So this could be the start of a beautiful relationship.
I'm happy to say that Dava Sobel will be signing copies of her book in the Fells room where you checked in this morning. So if you're eager to follow up on this wonderful discourse, please make sure that you check out her book and have it signed by her. And I wanted to let you know that lunch will be available in behind the stage and in the front of the hall as usual. And please make sure that you mark your calendars now for our spring meeting from April 23rd to the 25th, 2025. And before we start salivating over the prospect of lunch, make sure that you, if you possibly can, join Michelle McDonald for a tour of the library's treasures, which will include the letters that Dava was just referring to from Marie Curie to the APS. So please gather in the foyer of the library at 1:15 p.m. Because, as Michelle writes, second only to our member, the library is our greatest treasure. So we highly recommend that you join that tour if you haven't already seen these beautiful things. And the library is directly across from Benjamin Franklin Hall, and members of the APS staff will be out on the street directing you to the right place. For those of you taking advantage of the shuttle to the airport, there will be a shuttle leaving at 1 p.m. and another at 3 p.m. outside Benjamin Franklin Halls. The APS Museum will also be open today until 5 p.m. for those interested and who have the time to stay in Philadelphia in the afternoon. Thank you again for attending the meeting, and see you again next year.